Welcome back, everyone, to Data Science for Everyone. Today, we're going to be looking at
Measuring the size of the economy, the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, the values of the output of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. This measures the size of the nation's overall economy. An economy's GDP can be measured by either one, the total dollar value of what consumers purchase in the economy, two, the total dollar value of what the country produces. GDP measured by components of demand. Who buys all of a country's production? Demand for production can be divided into four main parts. One, consumer spending or consumption. Two, business spending or investment. Three, government spending on goods and services. And four, spending on net exports. Components of GDP on the demand side. For figure A, consumption is about 2/3 of GDP, but it moves relatively little over time. Business investment hovers around 15% of GDP, but it increases and declines more than consumption. Government spending on goods and services is around 20% of GDP. For figure B, exports are added to total demand for goods and services, while imports are subtracted from total demand. If exports exceed imports, as in most of the cases of the 1960s and 70s in the US economy, a trade surplus exists. If imports exceed exports, as in recent years, then a trade deficit exists. The GDP net export component or trade balance is equal to the dollar value of exports X minus the dollar value of imports M. Trade balance is the gap between exports and imports. The trade balance is equal to exports minus imports. A trade surplus, when a country's exports are larger than its imports, is calculated by exports minus imports. Trade deficit is when a country's imports exceed exports, calculated by imports minus exports. GDP using demand. Based on the four components of demand, GDP can be measured as such. GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus the trade balance. GDP measured by what is produced. Production can be divided into five main parts. One, durable goods, long lasting good like a car or a refrigerator. Two, non durable goods, short lived goods like food or clothing. Three, services, product in which is intangible in contrast to goods such as entertainment, healthcare, or education. Four, structures, building used such as a residence, a factory, an office, retail store, or for other purposes. And five, the changes in inventories, good that has been produced but has not been sold yet. Types of production. Services are the largest single component of total supply and representing over 60% of GDP, up from about 45% in the early 90s or early 60s. Durable and non durable goods constitute the manufacturing sector. They have declined from 45% of GDP in 1960 to about 30% in 2016. Non durable goods used to be larger than durable goods, but in recent years, non durable goods have been dropping to below the share of durable goods, which is less than 20% of GDP. Structures hover around 10% of GDP. The change in inventories is not shown since it is typically less than 1% of GDP. Final goods and services, which is output used directly for consumption, investment, government, and trade purposes. Goods at the furthest stage of the production at the end of the year. Intermediate goods is output provided to other businesses at an intermediate stage of production, not for final use. This is excluded from GDP calculation. Double counting. Output that is counted more than once as it travels through the stages of production. The potential mistake to avoid it in measuring GDP. GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced in the economy within a year. Other ways to measure the economy. Gross national product, which includes what is produced domestically and what is produced by domestic labor and business abroad in a year. Net national product, GNP minus the value of depreciation. Depreciation is the process by which capital ages over time and therefore loses its value. Net national product can be further subdivided into national income, which includes all of income earned, wages, profits, rent, and profit income. Adjusting nominal values to real values. Nominal value is the economic statistic actually announced at that time, not adjusted for inflation. Real value, an economic statistic after it has been adjusted for inflation. Generally, the real value is more important. Calculating real GDP. Real GDP is equal to nominal GDP divided by the price index divided by 100. Note that the price index is the same as the GDP deflator. For simplicity, the price index is traditionally published after being multiplied by 100 in order to get an integer number. So remember to divide the published price index by 100 when doing the math. Whenever a real statistic is computed, 1 year or period is called the base year or base period. The base year is the year whose price we use to compute the real statistic. Here's an example for calculating real GDP. To calculate real GDP in 1960, real GDP is equal to nominal GDP divided by price index divided by 100. Therefore, if we take the values of 543.3 billion divided by 19 divided by 100, we get 2,859.5 billion. 2005 is the base year. To calculate the real GDP for 2010, we see that the nominal GDP is equal divided by the price index divided by 100. So if we have 14,958.3 billion divided by 110 divided by 100, we get 13,598.5 billion. As long as inflation is positive, prices increase on average from year to year. Real GDP should be less than nominal GDP in any year after the base year. U.S. nominal and real GDP from 1960 to 2012. The black line measures U.S. GDP in real dollars, where all dollar values are converted to 2005 dollars. Since we express real GDP in 2005 dollars, the two lines cross in 2005. Real GDP will appear higher than nominal GDP in the years before 2005 because dollars were worth less in 2005 than in the previous years. Conversely, real GDP will appear lower in the years after 2005 because dollars are worth more in 2005 than they are in later years. Calculating real GDP growth rate. What is the real GDP growth rate from 1960 to 2010? We take 2010 real GDP minus 1960 real GDP divided by 1960 real GDP multiplied by 100. This is equal to the percentage change. We see that 13,598.5 minus 2,859.5 divided by 2,859.5 multiply 100 is equal to 376%. The U.S. economy increased real production of goods and services by nearly a factor of 4 since 1960. Tracking real GDP over time. Governments report GDP growth at an annualized rate. When analyzing growth in a quarter, the calculated growth rate of real GDP for the quarter is multiplied by 4 when it is reported, as if the economy were growing at that rate for a full year. A recession is a significant decline in national output or GDP. A depression is especially lengthy period of deep decline in the economy or in output. U.S. GDP 1900 to 2016. Real GDP in the United States in 2016 and 2009 dollars was about 16.7 trillion. After adjusting to remove the effects of inflation, this represents a roughly 20-fold increase in the economy's production of goods and services since the start of the 20th century. Patterns of recession and expansions. Peak. During the business cycle, the highest point of output before recession begins. Trough is during the business cycle at the lowest point of output in a recession before a recovery begins. A recession lasts from peak to trough, and an economic upswing runs from trough to peak. Business cycle. The economy's relatively short term movement in and out of recession. Comparing GDP among countries. To compare GDP for countries with different currencies, it is necessary to convert to a common denominator using an exchange rate. Exchange rate, the value or price of one currency in terms of another currency. For example, converting GDP to a common currency. For example, comparing Brazil's GDP from 2013 of 14.8 trillion real with the US GDP of 16.6 trillion for the same year. In 2013, the exchange rate was 2.157 real to $1. Let's convert Brazil's GDP into US dollars. We take Brazil's GDP in reals divided by the exchange rate. Here we see that this is going to equal 2.246 trillion GDP. Compare this value to the GDP in the United States to see in the same year. The US GDP was 16 trillion in 2013, which is nearly 8 times that of the GDP of Brazil. GDP per capita. The US economy has the largest GDP in the world and is also a populous country. Is the economy also larger on a per person basis? GDP per capita is the GDP divided by the population. How well GDP measures the well being of society. Standard of living, all elements that affect people's happiness and well being, whether they are bought or sold in the market or not. The difference between GDP and standard of living. GDP does not include leisure time, actual levels of environmental cleanliness, health, and learning, production that is not exchanged in the market, and the level of inequality in society, what technology products are available.
If you guys like this video, please make sure to comment, subscribe, and hit that like button, and I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.